Here it is at last.
Well.
This is the final chapter in a trilogy. Will it be redemption after the dark, unresolved second chapter? I think so. Will there be Ewoks? Definitely not.
Cut it out!
Except for that one. I had an ostensibly simple and straightforward objective with this video. Install a set of DiMarzio Model J pickups. But, as you'll see, once again, I found that nothing I expect to be simple and straightforward ever is. I'd actually said at the end of the last video that I was definitely going to order a Goto bridge. I've also decided I'm definitely going to order the Goto bridge as well. Oops, I forgot all about that. It's actually still in my cart on allparts.com. Turns out I really should have ordered that bridge, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Maybe, like the famous sci-fi series I keep referencing, there will actually be more than 3 episodes to this saga.
No.
Let's just worry about one thing at a time, though. It's time to unbox and install these DiMarzio pickups. Here's the box. My first thought was, wow, that's a lot of tape on this box. Then I opened it and thought, wow, that's a lot of bubble wrap for another box that also has bubble wrap inside of it. Plus foam around the plastic box the pickups were in with more foam. DiMarzio really does not want this stuff to get damaged. The box also included an instruction sheet and wiring diagram for the solderless harness. It's nice to have instructions, and a label on the package identifying exactly what kind of pickups are inside, so the picking and packing staff knew they were putting the right items in the box. These are things I wouldn't have even thought to point out before I bought stuff from Geiger.
That's not something you really need to specify.
You'd be surprised.
These DiMarzio solderless kits always come with a small DiMarzio branded flathead screwdriver. I have like 4 of these lying around now. And I always forget at first what they're even for, because the screws for both the pickups and the control plate are all Phillips. But then I did remember along the way that it's for the terminals the wires go into on the bottom of the control plate. The box also included 2 hex tools. I'm still not entirely sure what those are for. One does fit the set screws on the knobs. I think the pull pieces on these pickups are individually adjustable, although I'm not messing with it at this point, but that would be a likely explanation for the other one. So here's the underside of the control plate. The green plastic pieces are the terminals. They have double-sided adhesive foam so you can attach them wherever works best depending on the size and shape of the cavity of your individual base. Then there are the pickups themselves. DiMarzio ships pickups in a clear plastic box with a piece of foam you can cut up to use on the underside of the pickups. It's not something you'd notice from a distance, but the 2 pickups in a jazz bass set are not actually the same size. Because the string spacing tapers from the bridge to the nut, the neck pickup is actually a few millimeters shorter than the bridge pickup. It's easy to see when they're side by side. Here we have everything from the package. The wired up control plate, the 2 pickups with the necessary screws, and the hex tool for the pull pieces. I do actually see here that the inside of the pull pieces is hexagonal. The screwdriver, the smaller hex tool, presumably for the knobs, and 3 screws for attaching the control plate to the body. Time to get the bass on the bench and get to work. First, I needed to loosen the strings. If you missed the earlier videos in this series, these are Labella gold-white nylon tape-wound strings. Part of the reason for switching from the Geiger pickups to the DiMarzio pickups was to address a buzzing problem. There was a discussion in the comments about how the nylon wrap on the strings might be contributing to the buzz because there's no conductive contact being made with the strings. Keep this in mind for later. Next, I removed the pickguard and the control plate. Yeah, you don't actually have to remove the pickguard to do this, but I still like to. It's kind of like how George Costanza takes off his shirt in the bathroom, only I hope a little less weird. I do kind of enjoy the quirky look of the white, pink, and purple knobs, but I'm not planning to transfer these over to the new control plate. I've talked a bunch about how I don't solder, so you'll see I just have the wires from the old pickup spliced to the wiring harness. Why don't I solder? I just can't do it. I'm not entirely sure why. I've always struggled with fine motor skills, which has gotten worse as I've gotten older, but I don't think that explains it. In any case, I've just decided that it's not a skill I'm ever going to develop. Fortunately, this new DiMarzio set is a solderless kit, so I don't need to. Since I've got this piece of foam sitting here, I might as well start by cutting out the pieces I'm going to need under the pickups. The instructions say 3 inches by 5/8 of an inch, so that's what I did. Honestly, you could probably go with even less. This stuff only compresses so much, and these are fairly tall pickups. At least the cavities on this bass are deep enough. The first time I installed a set of these pickups was in 2019 on a first-run Squier Classic Vibe jazz bass, right after the Classic Vibe series replaced the old Vintage Modified series. The cavities weren't deep enough for the pickups, so I had to route them out, and I don't own a router. It was kind of a disaster. Now, when I installed the Geiger pickups in the first video about this bass, I foolishly didn't drill pilot holes. I did for the pickguard and the control plate, but not the pickups. The Geiger screws were made of much softer metal than these DiMarzio screws, and the heads got absolutely shredded. It was a stupid mistake on my part not to drill pilot holes. No need for any additional comments on that point. But I still say the screws were cheap because I've never had pickup screws get stripped the way those did, and I had to extract them with needle nose pliers. Anyway, now there are pilot holes. Unfortunately, they're not quite straight, so it makes adjusting the height of these pickups a little difficult. Once I had both pickups installed and the bridge pickups wires fed through the hole into the main control cavity, it was time to wire them to the control plate. At this point, I was reading the instructions rather than just working on my usual volatile mix of experience and intuition because I wanted to make sure I had the wires going to the correct terminals. The red wires go to terminal 1. The white and black wires go together into terminal 2, and the green wire goes into either terminal 3 or 4, which are both grounds. I noticed that the amount of exposed wire at the end of each was pretty short, maybe 3/16 of an inch. It seemed like it wasn't enough to make contact with the terminals, but it was. Of course, only after I had the wires attached did I get to the part of the instructions about cutting them to the correct length. Seems like that should have been mentioned first. So I cut the wires to remove a few inches of excess, stripped the ends, and reattached them. The instructions said to strip about 1/4 of an inch. I probably should have been a bit more careful. If you strip too much, it's possible the exposed wires might come into contact, shorting out and preventing any output. Maybe that's foreshadowing. You'll just have to wait and see. Now, there's one other problem I ran into with these instructions. They don't say anything about the grounding wire that runs under the bridge. I thought to myself, maybe that's why there's a second ground terminal. I've run into grounding issues enough times in the past that I wanted to make sure I get this grounded right. Fortunately, I have an example I can compare it to, which is good because I might need to do that more than once in this process. Maybe, just maybe, that's also foreshadowing. The pickups are a different model, but I have another of these DiMarzio solderless kits installed on my Squier 40th anniversary jazz bass, which happened to be sitting a few feet away. I swapped it onto the bench and removed its control plate so I could have a look at how I wired it up. This has been my main gigging bass this summer, and it sounds perfect, so I'm confident that if I just replicate how it's set up, we should be in good shape. Sure enough, I have its bridge ground wire run into terminal 4 of the wiring for the bridge pickup. Let's go with that. Oh, and in yet another bit of foreshadowing, please take a moment to observe how I shielded the cavities of this bass with copper foil. One of my very early gear videos featured that process. Link in the description. Okay, Primo back on the bench. I wired up the bridge ground wire, closed everything up, and because I was so confident everything was 100% perfect, I went ahead and restrung it without testing anything first. Then I decided to get out my Fender Rumble 40 amp and test it. That's the amp I use occasionally for rehearsals because it's small and light, but I don't gig with it because I've noticed it tends to pick up more electrical noise than my acoustic B100C, which is my main gigging amp. But that flaw is actually good for situations like this, because if there's a problem with the instrument's wiring, I'll definitely notice it. So yeah, everything works, but it's surprisingly noisy. Like, it doesn't seem any better than the Geiger pickups were. Remember how I said nothing is ever simple and straightforward? Remember all that foreshadowing? Here we go. Honestly, for a minute here, I started to second guess everything I've been saying about noisy pickups in earlier videos. Not just the Geiger pickups I had installed on this bass, but the stock pickups in the Squier debut Stratocaster, people thinking my asteroid sign, which is LED not neon, was generating the noise, everything. For 5 seconds, I let the fear take over.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Then I decided it was time to experiment. I have a perfect control subject in the form of that Squier 40th anniversary jazz bass. The first thing I needed to do was confirm that the issue was not just the amp or the wiring in this room. I sat down with both basses and tried them with the amp. Everything else was the same. Amp, cable, lighting, seating position, everything. With the Squier 40th anniversary, the amp is almost totally silent, but with the Primo, lots of buzz. Back to the bench. The first thing I did was check out the Squier one more time. I wanted to make absolutely sure I didn't have an additional ground wire installed. Nope. Aside from minor differences in the components DiMarzio delivered with these two kits and the bridge ground wire itself, the wiring setup between both of these basses is identical. The pickup models are different, but they're both DiMarzio and they're both advertised as being noiseless. As I mentioned earlier, I had tape-wound strings installed on the Primo. The nylon wrap on the strings prevents metal-to-metal contact, so it can very likely be the cause of grounding-related noise. The fact that this bass did get somewhat quieter when I was touching the bridge seems to reinforce that idea. I don't have any new string sets on hand at the moment, but I have a whole bin full of very lightly used strings. After rummaging through the bin, I settled on a set of Rotosound Swing 66 strings. I know they're good quality, and as a bonus, they're rounds. I prefer flats, but, well, I have flats installed on all of my basses right now. Having rounds on this bass would distinguish it and give me a reason to use it. I got it strung up and tested it out. Nope, it was not the tape-wound strings causing the buzz. Time to try something else, but I'm going to keep the Rotosounds installed. But first, another sanity check. Is the Squier really so quiet in this situation? Yes, and touching the bridge now that I have the Rotosounds installed doesn't really seem to make any difference on the Primo either, so let's move on. The next most obvious difference between the two basses is the shielding in the cavities. I installed copper foil shielding on the Squier because it arrived completely unshielded, but the Primo body had its cavities fully coated with shielding paint. Okay, well, I have plenty of copper foil. Why don't I just line these cavities myself? I've already decided this is turning into a full-day project anyway. The thing is, I did use my multimeter to test the shielding paint to make sure it was conductive. Would it really be worth the effort of removing the pickups again to line the cavities with foil? I was pondering that point as I got started, removing the pickguard and the control plate, and that's when it hit me. I don't know why I overlooked this in both of the previous two installments, but yeah, the cavities are shielded, but in order to create a proper Faraday cage, that shielding needs to make contact with the control plate. Typically, when I'm bothering to do this, I also line the back of the pickguard with foil, at least covering the area of the cavity. And I make sure the foil extends over the edge to one of the screw holes for both the control plate and the pickguard, making full electrical contact between all of the shielded parts of the instrument. Knowing that the shielding paint was good, then all I really needed were a couple of small strips of the copper foil folded over the edge to the screw holes to make that contact. That's a lot less work than reshielding the entire cavity. I closed things up, at least the control plate and a couple of the pickguard screws to ensure full contact with the foil, and tested. It was quiet. A little too quiet. Yeah, no sound at all. I knew from past experience, the Fender Acoustasonic Telecaster plus my old Squier 40th anniversary precision bass, after I did a similar upgrade, that if any part of the live wiring, especially on the output jack, comes in contact with the shielding, it will short out and you won't get any sound. In both of those previous cases, I solved the issue with a little bit of electrical tape over the point of contact. I checked, and yes, when the control plate was screwed down, the live wire on the outer edge of the output jack has an exposed solder point that was touching the new copper foil I had just added. I wrapped that solder point with electrical tape, and the problem was solved. Or so I thought. At first, everything seemed great, and I was pleased with myself for solving the problem because the buzzing noise was almost completely eliminated. It was the shielding, and maybe the tape-wound strings. But it probably wasn't the pickups. Perhaps I owe Geiker an apology. The Geiker pickups may not have been the cause of the noise at all. But then I remembered their crappy screws and all of the wrong items they sent me because they don't label anything, and what a nightmare the drop D tuner situation was, and I decided it doesn't matter. Those pickups might be okay, but the overall experience was bad enough that I don't want anything from Geiger installed in this bass. But like I said, at first, everything seemed great. Then I realized the neck pickup was shorting out. I opened up the control cavity, checked all of the wiring, and closed it up again. This time, the bridge pickup was shorting out. I repeated the process, and now both pickups seemed good, which is kind of maddening because I didn't actually change anything other than moving things around a bit. I suspect my earlier concerns that I had stripped too much of the wires is probably the issue. Those terminal ends of the live and neutral wires might have been coming into contact when I closed up the cavity in just a certain way. On the third try, I got lucky. That doesn't really bode well for the current state of this instrument because I might jostle it in such a way that they'll make contact again and short out again. Ultimately, I believe the solution is to trim a bit of each of the exposed wires so there's not enough extending outside of the terminals to come into contact with each other. I'll probably deal with that later because, yeah, I don't think this saga is ending just yet. For now, things seem to be where they need to be, so it was time to clean up my space and test things out. As I was getting ready to record the final demo for this video, I noticed a weird rattling on the open D string. I couldn't quite place it at first, but eventually I realized it was the bridge saddle. I shimmed the neck on this bass in episode 2 when I swapped on this bridge from a Fender Player Mustang, but even with the shim, I had to have the saddles cranked up really high. I noticed that the D string especially was so high that the adjustment screws were just about coming out the bottom of the saddle. That seemed to be causing the rattling. I decided that I needed to do a full setup on the bass. I didn't bother capturing it on video, but in short, I started with a truss rod adjustment. The tape wounds were lower tension than flats, but these rotosounds are even lower tension than those, so the neck was bowed slightly. After the truss rod, I decided to reset the saddles. I lowered them until the screws were just flush with the top edge of the saddles. Of course, that resulted in the strings being so low that they were touching the neck, so I had to shim it again. I know you can buy proper wooden neck shims, but I don't have any of those on hand, so I've just been cutting up business cards. I already had one in there, just aligned with the top screws, and I inserted a second one. It's maybe still not the perfect angle, but it was enough to make a difference. I tuned up and the bass was playable, but there was still some fret buzz, so I raised the saddles just a couple of turns each and was able to dial things in. I probably should do an intonation adjustment, but that's not as urgent. Finally, it was time to record the demo. Or so I thought. One more adjustment. I needed to raise the neck pickup just a bit. But as I noted earlier, since the pickup screw holes aren't perfectly straight, adjusting the pickup height is not quite as easy as it should be. I decided to unscrew the screws all the way so the pickup was fully floating. Then I slowly and evenly tightened down the screws just enough to get the pickup to a good height. There's a right way to do this, but it's a lot more time consuming. Ideally, you want to be testing the pickup's output levels as you're making these adjustments to find the optimal balance of volume and sustain. If the pickups are too low, they'll be too quiet, and if they're too high, the magnets can interfere with the free vibration of the strings. I didn't bother with that. I just eyeballed it and felt the height of the pickups relative to the strings with my fingers. And then I also plucked a few hard notes to make sure the strings didn't actually make contact with the pickups. Good enough for now. I guess this is the point where the Ewoks dance, except unlike George Lucas in 1983, I know the story doesn't actually end here. Also, I can't stand Ewoks. I feel like this bass is 100% usable as is, but I'm still not completely satisfied. For example, I didn't even mention it in this video, but I'm still having a lot of issues with the G-string tuner binding and slipping. I had a look at it while I was restringing the bass here, and I saw what the issue is. The teeth on the worm wheel are misaligning with the worm key. Yeah, I had to look up a diagram to know what those parts are called. The result is, the tuner gets really hard to turn, and then just when it feels completely stuck, it pops and turns again because the tooth has slipped into the next groove. These are the tuners from a Squier Affinity Precision Bass. They're adequate, but obviously not the highest quality. I'd love to get a new set of hipshot tuners, but yeah, those are not cheap. I also still plan to buy that Goto bridge. This Fender bridge, again, is adequate, but there are bridges that are so much nicer, and Goto bridges are pretty reasonably priced. While I'm at it, I'll probably also buy some proper wood shims for the neck. And at the point when I'm installing all of those parts, I'll also open up the control cavity one more time and see what needs to be done to guarantee that it never shorts out on me while I'm playing it live. If I ever take this bass to a gig, which at this point is still a big if. I guess that's it for this one. Nothing left to do but rock out. As always, thanks for going on this journey with me, and please click all of the things. Thanks for watching.
Well, I mean, so you'd have to...
You can go and have a bite. No, you'll still be hearing that one.
Yeah.